I'm a licensed therapist, and I want to talk about something that's been quietly shaping how therapy is practiced, but almost never discussed critically. That is the discussion of male privilege in therapy. And more broadly, how political ideology, when imported uncritically into the therapy room, can replace empathy, especially toward boys and men. Hi, I'm Gabby. I'm on a mission to expose the misandry that's taken root in academia and in the mental health field, and to help build a world where both men and women are seen and treated as fully human, and to remind people that masculinity is good. I actually never really would have realized this was a problem, but since I started my channel, I've gotten a lot of emails from men telling me that they had gone to therapy looking for help, but instead were shamed for not wanting to acknowledge their male privilege or for choosing not to see their pain through a strictly feminist lens. Most said that when their therapist refused to see the world outside of that framework, the relationship broke and they stopped going to therapy. And of course, not all therapy is like this, and not all therapists are like this, but it is happening enough that men are noticing a pattern. There are very valuable insights within feminist ideology, but when those ideas are imported into therapy in a way that assumes men cannot be oppressed because they are men, or predefines their role as privileged in every dynamic, they stop helping people heal. Instead, that framework blocks curiosity about the client's actual lived experience, and the therapist stops seeing the person in front of them. And I want to be really clear. I'm not making this video to criticize other therapists. I'm making it to criticize this framework because this is also how I was trained to see the world. In college, in graduate school, and even in clinical supervision, I was taught that men are oppressors and that women are oppressed. And I understand that this is sort of a political topic, but this is not about taking sides politically. This is about clinical accuracy. Because when ideology replaces curiosity, empathy dies. And when empathy dies, therapy stops working. These are really emotionally charged topics because the pain that they reference is real. And when people question the framing of privilege or oppression, it can sound like they're denying the pain of marginalized groups. Because a lot of times they are denying the pain of marginalized groups. But that's not what I'm doing. So let me acknowledge this up front. As I begin answering this question, some are going to assume that I'm suggesting women aren't uniquely victimized in society. That's not what I'm saying, and that's not true. I don't deny that women face unique forms of harm and danger in the world. What I'm saying is that men also face unique forms of harm and danger in the world. And that should be understood by therapists. Validating women's pain doesn't mean invalidating men's. Empathy is not a zero-sum game. But the frameworks that we've built around privilege and oppression make it feel that way. And that is the problem. Seeing men as oppressors and women as oppressed is far too simple of a framework. If we want our analysis of society at a systemic level to be truthful, we must be willing to recognize that men are oppressed and that men are oppressors, and that women are oppressed and that women are oppressors. And if we fail to recognize that men are also systemically oppressed, and instead default to believing that they are less oppressed than women, then we stop seeing men. We start seeing oppressors. And that influences how we conduct therapy with male clients. For the last 15 years, we've made incredible progress in understanding and invalidating female emotional experiences. And now it is time to bring that same compassion and curiosity to men and to the human experience of being male. Doing so isn't just important for men's well-being, it's also critical for the well-being of women. There is literally nothing that benefits women or society as a whole more than the presence of healthy, grounded, emotionally attuned men. So I ask you, please hold your pitchforks at least until the end, because this is not an attack. This is an invitation to look deeper at what's been lost when ideology replaces empathy, and what happens when we look at the collective before we look at the individual. If we want to answer this question honestly, we first have to understand what privilege actually means. And luckily, I still have my graduate school textbook, which states privilege exists when one group has something of value that is denied to others simply because of the groups they belong to, rather than because of anything they've done or failed to do. And honestly, I'm fine with that definition. If one group experiences hardships that another group doesn't have to, we could reasonably consider that first group to have privilege. If you grew up going to a good school with supportive teachers, you have educational privilege compared to someone whose school was underfunded or unsafe. If you grew up in a financially stable home, you have privilege compared to someone who is constantly worried about food or rent. Those are real, tangible advantages that make day-to-day life easier. But the next part of this is where things start to get sticky, because the chapter then goes on to explain that men can never be oppressed as men. In order to have the experience of being oppressed, it is necessary to belong to an oppressed category. In other words, men cannot be oppressed as men. Just as whites cannot be oppressed as whites, or heterosexuals as heterosexuals, because a group can be oppressed only if there exists another group with the power to oppress them. In this framework, men are oppressors, but they can never be oppressed. Not unless they have some other aspect of their identity that places them lower on the social hierarchy. The complexity of systems of privilege makes it possible, of course, for men to experience oppression if they also happen to be of color, or gay, or disabled, or in a lower social class. So what happens if a man does push back against this framework or brings up the fact that men do experience systemic oppression? That is not seen as critical thinking or as self-advocacy. It is interpreted as fragility or a lack of humility. When people hear that they belong to a privileged group or benefit from something like white privilege or male privilege, they don't get it. Or they feel angry and defensive about what they do get. Privilege has become one of those loaded words we need to reclaim so that we can use it to name and illuminate the truth. Their anger, frustration, or hurt isn't seen as a valid emotional response. It is seen as crying on the yacht. They may feel defensive or angry, as the book said, but we don't need to actually listen to them or hear them because we're the ones who are right about this. So we should think of them as angry toddlers who just want to maintain dominance and have it their way. That's how far this lens can distort empathy. It doesn't invite us to understand men. It instructs us to dismiss them. And it's super interesting because this framework reminds me a lot of how we used to treat women in psychology like 100 years ago. For centuries, if women spoke up about their pain, we labeled them as hysterical, as irrational, as exaggerated, or as manipulative, so that we didn't have to listen to what they were actually saying. And now, somehow we've totally flipped the script and started doing the exact same thing to men. When men express anger or confusion or defensiveness, we don't ask or question what's underneath it. We say, "You're not really in pain. You're just fragile, and you don't realize how good you have it." It's a different century, it's a different gender, but it is the same dismissal. If we are going to talk honestly about privilege, then we need to talk honestly about oppression. And that means acknowledging something that our culture rarely does, which is recognizing that men are also systemically oppressed. For decades, the cultural narrative has been that men hold most of the power, and that they've been the beneficiaries of every system. But if you actually look at the human cost of maintaining those systems, a different picture starts to emerge. I learned a lot about this from Warren Farrell. His work taught me that the strength or the success of a civilization depends on how effectively it can train, condition, or compel its men to sacrifice themselves for its survival. That idea is what he calls male disposability. Men are the ones who are sent to war. They are the ones who are expected to protect, provide, and produce, often at the expense of their own safety, health, and even their lives. And yet, modern feminist or social justice-oriented frameworks often refuse to recognize that reality. They see the power men hold, but they don't see the price that power demands. We often talk about the privileges that men have that women don't, but we rarely talk about privileges that women have, most notably for not being the sex who is expected to protect and to sacrifice their lives for everybody else. When we define men only by the harm that they've caused and that they cause, and not by the protection and sacrifice that they've offered and continue to offer, we lose the ability to see the full humanity in them. And that blind spot hasn't just shaped our culture, it's also influenced the culture of therapy. And I find that completely unacceptable. Let's shift gears for a second and talk about therapy. Therapy works because it focuses on the individual. This is how I like to explain therapy to my clients. So we all walk around our whole lives carrying this huge bag. And in this bag, we just stuff everything. So other people's expectations, the way that we were raised, our beliefs about ourselves and about the world, our memories, our trauma, everything that's ever happened to us that's been significant. That bag shapes how we see ourselves, our behavior, and how we move through the world. My job as a therapist is to sit with somebody and we're gonna go through that bag one by one and figure out what you wanna keep, what you wanna get rid of, what you wanna upgrade, what you wanna replace, etc. Ideology gets in the way of that. Because now, instead of seeing someone's individual story, through this framework, a therapist, theoretically, can predict that they know what's in that bag based solely on someone's immutable physical characteristic. Their race, their gender, their sexuality. Those things don't necessarily have to mean anything about someone's presenting problem or who they are or what they've experienced. That perspective is not human. That's not meeting someone where they're at. That isn't therapy. And to be very clear, therapists should understand systemic forces and societal issues and social context. Part of being a good therapist is knowing how safety, power, and shame can show up differently in people, but that understanding should only be used to help the person in front of you heal, not to convert them to a worldview that recenters their trauma around ideology instead of empathy. Okay, that's enough gabbing, let's answer the question. So obviously there are real differences in how men and women experience the world. And understanding those differences is a really necessary part of having healthy empathy and having healthy relationships with people of the opposite sex. I don't use the word privilege anymore because it's become so tied to this ideology. But the idea behind it, that people move through the world with different challenges and advantages, still matters. And in therapy, those differences are worth exploring when they serve the client's treatment goals. Because done thoughtfully, conversations about differences in experiences can deepen empathy and help people see the world through someone else's eyes. So let's talk about what those conversations might look like in practice with the ideology removed. Here's some times when I would talk about the male experience in therapy if I'm working with a female client. If I'm working with a woman and she speaks about sexual violence as if it's a uniquely female issue and carries hatred toward men because of that belief, I might gently introduce the idea that our culture pays far more attention to female victims than to male victims. And that lack of visibility can create this false sense that men don't experience sexual violence, when in reality, male sexual violence is deeply underreported, is widely misunderstood, and is often mocked or dismissed when it is acknowledged. And saying that is not to deny the very real and widespread sexual violence that women face, but it is to say that seeing men as villains by default flattens human complexity. And in therapy, we don't want to reinforce black and white thinking. We want our clients to expand their capacity for nuance, empathy, and relational connection, because blaming a group of people based on their gender, race, or sexuality is rarely supportive of long-term emotional health. In another example that I actually use all the time now that I've popped my ideological bubble, if I am working with a woman who is upset that her husband will not go to therapy, I think that it's really important to help her zoom out and contextualize what might be happening. Because many women, we grow up with our emotions noticed and responded to more than our male counterparts. Usually people pay far more attention to the feelings of girls than the feelings of boys. So many men never learn the skill of learning how to reflect or speak about their emotion. They're taught to manage it alone and in silence. So in therapy, going to talk about your feelings is introduced as just this fix-all solution. It can feel very foreign to them at best and shame-inducing at worst. So it's important to recognize that it might not be the case that your husband doesn't care, but it's just that emotional language was never part of his training. Our culture does this thing where we tell men that in order for us to love you, you need to be vulnerable. But then we don't create any spaces where they're emotionally protected. We ask them to open up, but then we don't make it safe for them to do so. And I think that's why when some men are asked if they'd rather talk about their feelings to a woman or to a tree, they choose the tree, because the tree is not going to judge them or shame them or moralize them or treat them differently. It's just going to listen. And I think as women, if we want the men in our life to open up emotionally, we need to create spaces where they can feel that same safety. We need to understand them enough that we're able to actually protect them. And what happens overwhelmingly is that when women understand that perspective, they're generally like, oh, that makes a lot of sense. And they have so much more respect and patience and empathy for the men in their life. And from that place, real connection actually becomes possible because empathy replaces resentment. Likewise, there are times when I would use the female experience to help men expand their empathy. So if a male client is like, women should just say no when he's talking about coercive sexual violence, and that came from a place of confusion or frustration, I wouldn't shame him for not understanding why women might not just say no. I would help him understand that for women, these situations can be really tricky to navigate because women, on average, are smaller and weaker than men. So sometimes just saying no doesn't feel safe, or it might make the situation a lot worse. Men who have never been abused or physically overpowered might not understand what the feeling is like to have someone want something from you sexually, while also understanding that they have the physical power to take it from you if they want it. And that fear is something that most women have had to contend with, even if they've never really explicitly put words to it. So sometimes a woman might go along with something sexually, not because she wants to, but because she feels like it's the safest option in that moment. And talking with a client about this is not moralizing him or assigning guilt. It's just about helping him to understand another person's reality, one that might be entirely outside of their own lived experience. And I want to acknowledge that men experience that as well, but I'm just providing a specific example here. Another example might be if a male client is frustrated that his wife seems angry or distant at home and keeps nagging him about housework even though he feels like he's doing his fair share. In those moments, it might be helpful to introduce the idea of what's often called the second shift. It is the idea that many women, even when they work full-time jobs, are expected to come home and take on the majority of the emotional and the household labor. Things like remembering birthdays, planning meals, keeping track of appointments, noticing when the laundry needs to get done, or tending to the emotional needs of the family. So if a man is struggling to understand why his partner seems to be feeling overwhelmed, knowing this perspective could help him recognize an imbalance that could be there. Because sometimes the issue isn't about who's doing more, but it's about who's feeling unseen. But once again, I would only bring these perspectives up if they served that person's treatment goals, never to blame men or women as a group, but to help one individual develop empathy for experiences outside of his or her own. This ideology collapses nuance. It makes assumptions, and it assigns moral worth based on one's demographic information, instead of their behavior or the content of their character. But worst of all, it blocks connection, which is at the heart of therapy. Therapy works not because we sit down with you and calculate whether or not you're oppressed or an oppressor. It works because we sit down with you as a human, and we understand you as a human while acknowledging our own humanity. We can talk about the ways that men have privileges that women don't, as long as we're also willing to talk about the ways that women have privileges that men don't. That balance is what makes the conversation human and what makes therapy actually work. This issue isn't actually about men's rights, it's about human dignity. Therapy must start from the premise that all people suffer, and that suffering is valid no matter the group identity of the person sitting in front of you. Because if we decide that your pain is more valid or that your suffering is worse because you have the identity of an oppressed group, that's not an accurate or trauma-informed lens. That is a bias dressed up as empathy. Healing requires truth. And the truth is that men deserve the same compassion and consideration that has been extended to every other group for the past 15 years. And if you're a mental health professional watching this, the odds are that you've seen this problem too. If you believe that men and women's pain are equally human and both deserve to be centered and to be treated with respect and care in the therapy room, I want to create a referral list of clinicians who are able and willing to see and prioritize male pain in a way that's compassionate, nuanced, and human. If that's the type of therapy you practice, please shoot me an email. I get a lot of messages asking for referrals, and I would love to have a referral list of people with whom I'm clinically aligned. Thank you so much for watching. Therapy is something that I feel very passionately about, and it's very deeply upsetting to me that this ideology has influenced whether or not clinicians are able to actually see male grief. This channel and this video are my attempt at trying to correct that. So I really appreciate your support, and I will see you in the next video.